So, hi, and welcome to the Land Pioneers podcast, where we meet some of the industry's most prominent land developers and experts in the industry. Listen to their gems and learn from the experience of these experts. And today's guest is super impressive Jacob Vince from Atlas Economics. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you, Stan. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So, for a bit of a change of pace, I wanted to interview an economist really intimately involved in major projects right around the country, because ultimately land subdivision projects, they're driven by demand from changing demographics and the supply of available land. So, Jacob Vince, he's a land economist with over a decade of experience in shaping some of Australia's most complex property and planning projects. He's an associate director at Atlas Economics, where he has spent the last 5 years developing economic strategies and feasibility studies for major developments across New South Wales, Victoria, and Australian Capital Territory. So, Jacob began his career with New South Wales Health, and he's held positions at AEC Group, and finally, he is now at Atlas, where he quickly advanced from senior consultant to his current leadership role. His diverse portfolio of projects includes large urban renewal precincts, detailed land use strategies, and state planning policy. He's also really recognized for his ability to present economic insights in a clear and practical manner, which is why I wanted him on a podcast. There's economists that you can barely understand because of how they speak about numbers. Um, he combines thorough analysis with actionable advice that empowers his clients to make informed decisions. And with a keen eye for both local and overseas trends, Jacob approaches every project with a strong data driven mindset. But before we get too far into the session, just briefly a little bit about Eagle Vision, who are the sponsors for the Land Pioneers podcast. And with over 17 years of dedication to our craft, we've delivered 3D visualization excellence across nearly 720 projects, including approximately 40 land estate subdivisions. So, what makes Eagle Vision unique? Here are three of these, and where we may be a good fit for land developers around the country. Less is more, 24/7, and extreme transparency. So, less is more. We focus on strategy, not just pretty pictures. And with our founder's background in property development, the strategy aspect of 3D visuals is by far the most important component and takes priority over everything else. 24/7 around the clock. Our team being based in Australia and Europe, we work on a 24-hour turnaround basis to increase the pace of delivery for our clients and their projects. And ultimately, extreme transparency, no surprises. We pride ourselves on creating utmost transparency in our operation, and we've built systems and processes to involve the clients at every step of the way. They get to see the inner workings of the machine, and they can track their project's progress intimately. Um, we're also constantly on the lookout for what technology is coming down the pike and what may have the best application to solving our clients' problems, whether it's AI or interactive visualizations. We're constantly experimenting with them to ensure the best return on our clients' investments. So, experience the future today. Visit us at www.eaglevision.com.au and discover a world of possibilities. Now, back to our guest, Jacob. Welcome. So, let's talk about economics. How did you get into it all? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, thank you, Stan, and thank you for that very succinct and glowing bio at the start. I can assure everyone that I did not write that, but that was very, very kind of you, Stan, so thank you. How did I get into land economics? Well, I must say, I sort of fell into it at university. I went to Western Sydney University where I studied as a property valuer. And immediately after university, I worked for New South Wales Government, for New South Wales Health, in their property team there, where I managed divestments and other property dealings there. And then after 2 years in government, I sort of saw my opportunity to move on and get into the private sector, and really fell into what was a real emerging sort of sector at the time, which was property economics or land economics. And I've been there ever since. I did 5 years consulting at another firm, and we've recently started Atlas Economics about 5 years ago. So yeah, it's been a bit of Bit of a
Exciting
journey.
ride.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
very good. All right. So, how do developers, I guess, need to think about land economics?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different ways to answer that question. First and foremost, land economics really underpins the viability of a project, and that can be influenced by market demand factors, or it could be influenced by supply side issues as well. So understanding the type of land use that is appropriate within any particular area or market, the amount of that land use, who you're going to be marketing to, what that land use is ultimately worth, and if you need to demonstrate that a change to planning controls is something that should be pursued or should be considered by any local authority, you need to have a sort of an economic argument to help that stack up. So there's the financial side of things behind land economics, which is your feasibility analysis, your highest and best use studies. But if you're looking to demonstrate to a local council or to a state government that a change to planning controls is required, a really strong economic argument is critical to making that case.
Yeah. Look, I wanted to throw in a bit of a curvy question. So, in business, there are lagging indicators and leading indicators. And I'm sure this same thing applies to a feasibility analysis of a development. So, what are those kind of elements like demand and supply, or demand of the demographics would be, I guess, that leading indicator? Is that right?
Yes and no. I mean,
Okay.
we often look backwards to start if we're trying to understand the opportunity for a site or a precinct. And when I say look backwards, we might be looking backwards at demographic data, for instance. So how has a particular area changed in terms of its residents or its workers? And we can do that by looking at various different data points. But to your point, we can also look forward and try and understand, well, how is that area expected to change? And there's a lot of different data sets that you can look at
Yeah.
that.
And then that can be then a bit of an underpinning for the strategy for how that area would be redeveloped or changed in its zoning
Right,
nature.
absolutely right. Probably a good example of that is understanding, well, what type of housing would be appropriate for this area. We know
Mm,
Australia, across Australia, but particularly its east coast, the population is aging dramatically and
yep.
household sizes are coming down. We also know that in a lot of parts of the east coast, it's quite a homogenous housing market with a lot of detached product, larger detached housing product. So, how do we spot the opportunities where more sort of medium or higher density housing could be brought in to accommodate demand from those smaller households moving forward? That's probably a good
Yeah.
example.
And this is why we've seen so much smaller redevelopments of the bigger blocks changing into two, three unit subdivisions, basically.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Right. So, but that's more for urban infill kind of areas. How do you apply those same strategies to the outlying growth corridors?
Yeah, that's a good question because we know in a lot of the greenfield areas on the outskirts of our capital cities, that's where your younger families and maturing families they want to go and reside. That's where they want to build their life effectively. And understanding the types of residents that are moving into those areas, particularly given our high levels of international migration, what types of communities are moving there, what are their particular requirements. A lot of first generation migrants will live in larger families with second and third generation of those families, and that in turn influences the type of housing products that you might want to be developing in your greenfield areas. So understanding what those different sort of drivers are and those different demographics is really important for greenfield developers.
Yeah. And so is that then coming down to affect lot sizes of what
Could be,
is?
yeah, it could be lot size, could be housing typology, the size of a particular house, how many bedrooms, really getting into that nitty gritty amount of detail to sort of understand, well, what are the different buyer profiles that we're seeing out here and what are the typologies that we should be trying to provide to
Yeah.
suit those.
Meaning double story, single story product.
Exactly right, exactly right. And, going along the continuum of we're starting to see, particularly down in Victoria and in Sydney, more and more medium density products being delivered in the
Really
greenfield areas, yeah, and in the ACT in particular.
interesting. And so, what are the sort of in those medium density products? I imagine there'd be two-story townhouses or terraces that are next to each other. Do they end up with single car parks, double car parks? What do you see?
Yeah, they could be single or double car parks. They could be a mix of what we call front loaded, so your garage at the front, or rear loaded, and you might have a small laneway at the back. The latter is probably a more efficient way to get density in,
Yep.
but it is something that's particularly only starting to emerge in some of those greenfield areas because it's a different type of product. But if you couple
Right.
that kind of product with great public open space on the front, then it can be a really attractive way to live.
Yeah. And do you find that those communities are accepting and interested in that kind of a lifestyle?
They are, and there's certainly a lifestyle benefit with that because we have seen a general trend towards smaller lot sizes across Australia, not just the east coast, but across Australia. Adelaide, Perth, lot sizes have historically been coming down.
Mm.
One driver of that is, of course, lifestyle benefits, maintaining a smaller lot, not as much work.
Convenience there.
Yeah, not as much work to do on the weekend, all that kind of thing. But the key driver is affordability.
Right.
And the smaller lot or the smaller product that a developer is able to bring to market, it's obviously got a lower price point, which enables more and more people to get access to the market.
That's interesting. So, in most of the states, the government planning departments often also take charge of land releases. I know that that happens quite a lot in Australian Capital Territory, same as here in South Australia. How do New South Wales and Victoria handle that side of it?
Yeah, so it's yeah, the obviously the ACT and to a degree South Australia are a little bit unique in that regard, given that they are in the ACT anyway, the primary developer in the
Mm,
greenfield market, where they control the amount of greenfield land and they release that in a staged process. In New South Wales and in Victoria, that process is effectively left to the market. So
right.
the planning departments have a role in rezoning and precinct planning and ensuring that infrastructure is ideally there before they rezone, but unfortunately that's not always the case. Their role is more of that sort of precinct planning, town planning, strategic planning sort of role with the actual delivery. That's the onus of the market.
For the private developers from there.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
And so, what is the difference in the approach then for, especially maybe the ACT, if you can talk about that, for, I guess it's Suburban Land Agency that's doing
That's right.
that work there. So, what is their, how is it different, like their approach to a private developer that's doing things in, let's say, Victoria or South or New South Wales?
Yeah, so the Suburban Land Agency in the ACT, they have a what they call an indicative land release program. Now, that's basically a program that they release annually that outlines how many lots and how many development sites are going to be released over the next 5 year period. So they are able to they ideally try and link that to what they think housing demand will be and ensure that there's a sufficient amount of supply being brought to market. Now, given that New South Wales and Victoria don't have that sort of role from a lead government agency, that is effectively left to the private markets, and where how much supply can be brought on is effectively limited to the capacity of the development sector to bring that online, which is in turn linked to do we have enough land that is serviced and ready to be developed? And unfortunately, that's just not the case typically in Sydney and Melbourne.
Most of the time, yeah, yeah. But just going back to their, I suppose, attitude. So perhaps the financial objectives are not quite as large of a driver for government agencies. So what happens for them
Yeah,
instead?
correct. Just spot on. Like it's across government projects, across the states. government doesn't just have financial objectives when they release land to the market. They obviously have to consider a whole bunch of other considerations, environmental factors, broader economic and socio-economic factors. For instance, the Suburban Land Agency in the ACT, whenever they typically release large mixed-use developments to the market, they require a proportion of any future development there to be provided as affordable housing. So they
Okay,
have
right.
those non-financial, and there's obviously a financial disadvantage of doing
Mm,
that.
yep.
But they obviously have those broader sort of economic and social remits to adhere to.
Yeah. Does it lead to a better outcome for a subdivision?
It can do. It certainly can do, particularly in the greenfield areas where you can have a bit of a salt and pepper approach of market and affordable housing. That has clear, and it's been demonstrated to have clear social benefits. And you're
Mm,
providing a diverse community, and you're also ensuring that there's a constant supply of subsidised housing products brought to the market, which is, as we're seeing in New South Wales and Victoria, much harder to do when you apply when you require the private sector to do it.
yeah, right. Okay. Um, so it sounds great, but on the flip side, is there perhaps a downside to that sort of large scale approach of we just do this?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that approach means is that you don't have a competitive market. You've really got, in the ACT and perhaps in South Australia, where you've got these large government agencies primarily doing a lot of the greenfield development. You've really only got one active developer in the market, which means it's difficult for there to be multiple development fronts. And if there comes a scenario where demand goes incredibly steep for a certain amount of time, and that hasn't been accounted for in their long-term planning for the next 4, 5, 6 years, then that can mean that demand outstrips supply, and we know what happens when that occurs.
Challenges with housing prices and people start complaining a lot about affordability. Yeah. But I think more to that point, it's more just the nature of that approach being fairly rigid rather than being adaptable to what the market forces may be, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And there's a degree of rigidity in all of government projects, not just housing, but any sort of strategic planning work that gets done. That's really just a function of the way that government works, and they are quite risk adverse. They're obviously trying to manage many competing priorities. Many of them often political, so it can be challenging. But it's certainly frustrating from a developer's perspective when you really just want to get on and see some outcomes occur, when you're often fighting up against quite a rigid system.
Yeah. Look, the other challenge that I've often seen is the coordination between different government agencies often isn't quite there. We've experienced this in South Australia where SA Water has one particular ability to deliver, and then private developers may have another. And maybe government agency may have some other outcomes and strategies in mind. So, how do you find that across New South Wales, Victoria, ACT?
Yeah, it's one of the most pressing issues in those states' development sectors. The common misalignment between strategic planning and the release and rezoning of new land, and the capacity of that land to be serviced. And it's frequently resulted in a whole heap of land being rezoned and the colours on the map being changed, but that land can't be developed because there's no plans to have your water and sewerage connections delivered until another 10 years. And that's something really, really frustrating, and something that we have been championing governments to do better, with better alignment between particularly water authorities and planning authorities. It's something that I think is starting to improve. I know in New South Wales they've got a real mission to try and align that a bit better, particularly, and you can see that being done around the Western Sydney Aerotropolis with the new airport that's being delivered out there. But you only have to look a little bit further, and you can see plenty of examples where it hasn't been done, and it's resulting in increasing pressure on different markets, whether that's residential, industrial is a big one.
Yeah. So as much as the government may say, yeah, you can go and develop, but if there's no service provision, you're sitting tight for a long, long time.
And look, there's ways around it, and government can partner with the development sector to try and ensure that some of that servicing infrastructure can be delivered ahead of time and perhaps funded by the development sector and repaid or recouped from the government at a later date. That's a workaround. It's not ideal because what you're then doing is you're precluding a lot of your smaller and medium sized developers who don't have the capital to invest in significant infrastructure upgrades to unlock land. And you're really leaving it to your tier one developers who have the capacity to do that. So it's a workaround solution, but it's not the solution. We need to align.
So there are solutions to this.
Yeah, of course. First and foremost, we need to align our precinct planning or strategic planning with our infrastructure planning.
Right. Okay. Interesting. All right. So we've touched on a little bit on affordable housing. I'd love to hear a bit more of your thoughts around what's happening in that space across the eastern seaboard.
Yeah, yeah. So it's certainly one of our probably my sort of my favourite sector to work in because you actually get to see some really great outcomes occur, and we are in the midst of a housing crisis, and while it's been the talk of the town for probably 3 years now, ever since the signing of the housing accord, it's been an issue long before that. And anyone who's lived in Melbourne and the ACT and Sydney can attest to that. I'm sure elsewhere in the capital cities as well. So affordable housing, what is it? A lot of people get sort of a bit confused between what affordable housing is and what social housing is. Social housing is, if you think of housing on a continuum, at the very end, we're providing housing for people who are homeless and shelters and that kind of thing, and that's people who are desperate in need of housing. Sort of further up the continuum you go, you start to provide forms of social housing, which is housing effectively provided by the government for people on very low and low incomes, and ensuring that housing is provided at a certain cap of their income. Now, affordable housing is somewhere in the middle there before you start getting to the private housing or market housing, is what we call it. Affordable housing is often provided to households also eligible for social housing, but it's
Recent migrants. Yeah.
yeah, but also provided for key workers and for people on moderate incomes. So that could be local teachers, local nurses, local police officers who need to live and work within an area, but they might not necessarily be able to afford to live in that area. So it's a slightly higher sort of income threshold, and it's typically managed not by government but by the community housing sector.
Right. Okay. And so, what are some of the examples of it that you've seen being done well?
Yeah, look, what we found is it's done well when it's done at scale. And the best opportunities for things to be done at scale is when you have a very large rezoning or a large urban renewal project, where you enable a partnership to occur between a private developer and a community housing provider. Now, it's been done for quite a while in Sydney, where some councils have required the contribution towards a monetary contribution towards affordable housing, irrespective of whether a development is via rezoning or under existing planning controls. That enables a bit of a pool of money to be secured, and that pool of money can then be provided from council to a community housing provider to go out into the market and try and purchase a site to deliver affordable housing, or purchase just dwellings in general for affordable housing. That's great. The downside of that is that means that a community housing provider has to compete with the private sector when they go out and try and acquire a site. And in a rising market, that can be cost prohibitive for a CHP to do. Now, in a scenario where you've got a very large rezoning, and you require, okay, if this area is going to be rezoned, it's going to be rezoned for a mixed use precinct. However, we want to see X percentage of affordable housing delivered. That developer could then partner with a community housing provider, and they can then basically design and build
Mm.
affordable housing from the very start, which CHPs as charities are not subject to a number of state and federal taxes, and they also have access to cheaper debt funding. So they
Right.
can typically build housing at a lower rate compared to the private sector. So if you bring those guys in and enable them to develop on a very large precinct where you can carve off a little bit of the site where they can go in and build, you get greater affordable housing outcomes. So there's been multiple examples of that done in New South Wales and in Victoria, particularly in your larger urban renewal areas.
Yeah. Question around that though. So let's say we've got a large rezoning that's happened, a large subdivision. Part of it may include a bit of a town centre sort of area. Would the location of that affordable housing, because I imagine the land that is sold to a CHP is sold at a discount. So then that land, like where strategically would be the best place to position that area for affordable housing compared to everything else that is maybe more premium, less premium? Is there anything like that?
Well, in greenfield areas, one of the key things that a developer wants to do is, if they're going to also be building a local town centre, is they want to get that town centre up and going as soon as possible, because that provides amenity for existing residents, and that can quicken your take up rate across the entire precinct. The thing with affordable housing is there's a huge pool of demand. So you're going to be able to get, particularly if it's sort of your low rise apartments or anything like that, which if they were delivered as market housing might take a little bit of time to get going in an initial subdivision. You could bring that type of development provided as affordable housing close to the town centre. You could bring that forward, and that would enable your town centre to get up and becoming viable in a quicker time period. So we always recommend placing affordable housing around your sort of amenity nodes. One, because it's just a better social outcome, but also because you can actually enable your town centres to become operational at a much quicker rate, which benefits the development faster in general.
Yeah, great thought. All right, so we've touched on affordable housing. Now let's look at infrastructure. So you've touched on briefly on Western Sydney. How do infrastructure projects get handled in terms of economics?
Yeah, it's something that we frequently look at, and it's a question that we frequently get asked by both government and by larger developers. Is, okay, we're planning on this huge new piece of infrastructure investment. What is going to be the likely impact on the surrounding land use markets? What does it mean for residential? What does it mean for industrial? What does it mean commercial, retail, etc.? So understanding what are the opportunities that would result from a new piece of infrastructure investment is something that we will often look at. And I did mention the Western Sydney Airport. We did a lot of work looking at the initial rezoning around that about 4 or 5 years ago, trying to understand, well, we've got this huge $1 billion piece of new infrastructure. What are going to be the opportunities for industrial uses, for agribusiness uses? So that's something that will have to be investigated, because it can also be considered in the context of a larger business case for that piece of infrastructure. So you're unlocking all of this sort of value creation that might not just necessarily be focused on that piece of infrastructure, but it influences the broader area as well.
Yeah. So a question around that. With the trends currently, there's been, from an outsider's sort of view, been a massive amount of government investment, federal and state, since 2020 into large scale infrastructure projects. Is the trend coming down from those projects, or is it going up? Where is sort of that at?
Yeah, look, I think it's if anything, it's likely coming down in probably the next 6 or 7 years as a number of those larger projects come to completion. The Western Sydney Airport is completing next year, so we'll have planes in the sky over Western Sydney by the end of next year. Down in Victoria, we've got the West Gate Tunnel, which we ideally completed within the next 2 years. Fingers crossed. So there's a number of and there's a number of rail projects as well that are nearing completion, both in Victoria and in New South Wales. So as those projects come to an end, there'll hopefully be a bit more capacity in the construction sector, because what we've seen is a lot of this crowding out effect, and you've got these very well-paying infrastructure projects sucking up a lot of labour, particularly skilled labour, which is resulting in what we've seen, a pretty rapid rise in the cost of construction across Australia in the last 5 years.
Yeah. And that's kind of the gripe for a lot of private developers, that why would labor come to them if they're getting paid almost double for some of the maybe even simpler work than what they were doing on the private sites?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and it's a wicked problem, because we know we need to deliver way more housing than we ever historically have done, in order to meet future demand, and we're well short of meeting the housing that was targeted under the housing accord. In order to do that, we need to probably increase the size of our labour force, our construction labour force, where we're going to house all of those residents. So it's a devilish issue, and it's something that I think we really need to begin properly thinking about, in terms of how can technology and how can modern methods of construction and how can other ways of doing business in the sector help us do more with less effectively. If you look at the productivity of different sectors over the past 20 years, a lot of sectors have grown rapidly in terms of their productivity. Construction isn't one of them. That's just a factor. That's largely a factor of the way the industry is I suppose, segmented. We've got a very large concentration of small and medium-sized enterprises, which don't have the I suppose, financial capacity to invest in doing different ways of business. They're just going from project to project and doing things the way that they've always been done, which is not an attack on them. It's just a fact of life. But if we're really going to be serious about meeting this challenge, then I think robotics, modern methods of construction, all these, there's multiple different elements that we should be looking at, and I think the government should be investing in much more research and development in trying to and see some of these methods come to fruition.
Yeah. So bringing it back to some of these infrastructure projects, are they being done on a reactionary basis, or are they being proactive with the scope for future demand? Like, let's say this Western Sydney airport, how desperately did that area need a new airport?
If you asked any of the elected officials who made those decisions, then I guarantee you they would tell you they were being proactive as opposed to being reactive. But in the case of the Western Sydney Airport, that was certainly needed. The existing Sydney Airport operates under a curfew, and it's in the next couple of decades it really will be nearing capacity. The Western Sydney Airport, which opens next year, will be operating under a 24/7 basis, much like Tullamarine down in Melbourne, and that is not going to generate opportunities for passenger travel, but also for air freight, and that's why they've had this very strong sort of vision around creating a bit of an agribusiness precinct around the airport in order to now enable that sector to service the quickly growing markets in Asia. So,
Yeah. So a lot of the primary producers all across Hunter Valley and down and around, being able to deliver things to Western Sydney Airport and then shoot them out to Asia.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. So, that was certainly something that should have gone ahead. There's a lot of question marks about some other projects happening at the moment, particularly down in Victoria, about whether or not they should be going ahead, um, or perhaps should they be going ahead at a later date. That's open to interpretation.
Yeah, right. And what about, yeah, so things like suburban rail loop, right? Uh, what is your feeling about the need for a project of that nature?
Look, it's a visionary project. It's modelled on what we see in a lot of the other sort of mega cities across the world. London being one with the tube network, and I certainly see the benefits behind it in that you're going to begin removing a lot of the risks associated with a rail network that sort of all begins at one central node. So if you have more of a radial network, there's less risks over time. It's an incredibly expensive project. It's occurring at a time that the Victorian state government down here is in a significant amount of debt and is not projected to change that in the medium term. And personally, I think that there's a number of other projects that could be worthy of closer investigation and prioritisation above that particular project. The airport rail is certainly one of them. But to the state government's credit, they've done a lot of precinct planning work around the initial stage one of the suburban rail loop. Um, will that result in a positive economic benefit?
Time will tell, I suppose. Recently we traveled through Japan and Singapore, and it seems that their train systems are actually built on. I heard this crazy theory, like it's a chaos theory uh,
Mm.
nature, or in fact a virus. So how would the it spread, and then based on the spread is how they shot out
Yeah,
their things. So definitely not just a circle around the entire city, hoping that people are going to be using that.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's doing these very large scale projects or transport projects in Australia has always been difficult given the size of the country and the size of the population. It makes it very challenging to stack up from an economic point of view. But that said, these big rail projects, particularly if we're able to eventually get one that goes from, capital city to capital city, those are the things that can unlock more housing supply. So it's certainly something that's worth investigating. We'll see. We'll see whether or not suburban rail lives up to the benefits that it espouses to.
Yeah, fair enough. Very good. Look, that's we sort of covered over all of the things that I wanted to chat about. Uh, Thank you so much for your time. Again, for those people listening and watching, if you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a comment and like and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of content. And Jacob, have a fantastic day. Thank you again.
Thank you, Stan. Appreciate it.
Okay,
Bye now.
absolutely.